The Victorian chapel of St. Dorothy's crowned the highest ridge in the Berkshires, as though a sculptor had lifted it from the valley floor and set it against the sky for better viewing. Morning thunderstorms had rolled east an hour earlier, and the departing clouds still trailed strands of silver rain that dissolved before touching the autumn woods below. Inside the nave, the air mingled sharp evergreen resin that seeped from century-old timbers with the faint metallic scent of wet stone. The florists had layered that natural perfume with armfuls of white lupines and bronze anemones until the whole space felt like a greenhouse masquerading as a sanctuary. At the back of the aisle, Delilah Hartwell paused long enough to feel the wooden floor breathe under her satin shoes. The organist eased into the first bars of Mendelssohn, and the swell of music should have buoyed her forward. Yet something in the hush between chords made the goose-flesh rise beneath her lace sleeves. 200 invited guests pivoted in unison to admire her entrance, but their faces were mostly filtered through the screens of their phones. The Vaughn family had opened a live stream so philanthropic partners as far away as Singapore could witness. The ceremony that would fuse the Hartwell Preservation Trust and Vaughn Legacy Foundation into a single juggernaut of cultural heritage rescue. Spotlights mounted to the nave columns pumped a tasteful glow across Delilah's beaded gown, and the camera drones hovering near the clear-story windows tracked her like patient birds of prey. She managed to smile, reminding herself that the lenses were gathering donations, not scandal, and began the march down the aisle, bouquet trembling a fraction faster than her heartbeat. Halfway to the altar, she realized the organist had begun improvising, abandoning Mendelssohn for a wandering, unresolved series of chords. Her eyes followed his line of sight and fixed on the polished mahogany prie-dieu, where Sterling Vaughan, indie film prodigy, tabloid aesthete, heir apparent to media empire V-Sphere, should have been standing radiant and repentant for every missed rehearsal. The oak platform was empty except for a boutonniere, whose anemone had already begun to wilt at the edges, as if even the flower understood it had been left on stage after the final curtain. A ripple passed through the pews, a tiny collective inhale that tasted of confusion and bright panic, and the drones drifted, suddenly directionless, like gulls whose fishing boat had vanished beneath them. Delilah's maid of honor stepped from her place, eyes wide with a question that never reached voice because at that precise instant the wedding coordinator's headset blasted an alert that everyone within 6 feet could hear. A voicemail from Sterling had arrived. The coordinator's face blanched the color of altar linens. She pressed the phone to her ear, listened, then whispered to the officiating pastor, who in turn cleared his throat, an action amplified by every microphone embedded in the pulpit rail. The pastor's customary serenity faltered. He murmured something to an acolyte, and the organist switched yet again, this time to a soft, formless prelude meant to cover silence rather than celebrate union. Delilah forced her feet the remaining distance to the steps, head held at an angle that might, to a distant camera, resemble composure. Up close, her hazel eyes flicked between the deserted spot where Sterling should have stood, and the side aisle where she half expected him to burst in, laughing at his own poor timing, ready to spin some avant-garde stunt into a proposal of even greater devotion. A full minute dripped past. Crystal pendants dangling from iron chandeliers clicked gently against one another as the draft of the old heating system cycled on, and the congregation, sensing the shape of catastrophe, began a whisper that rolled up the nave like distant surf. To her left, in the shadow cast by the choir loft, stood Calloway Vaughan. He had been relegated to that corner at his own request, preferring anonymity to the first-row glare that attached to the Vaughan name. Where Sterling thrived on cameras, Callaway specialized in remaining just outside their frame, pulling financial levers that decided which startups would reshape markets and which would be eaten by them. The chapel's stained glass reflections dappled his charcoal suit, but his eyes remained unnervingly steady on Delilah, not with the curiosity of a spectator, but the diagnostic gaze of a structural engineer confronted by an unexpected stress test. In that instant he moved, slow, deliberate, parting a sea of murmuring onlookers, to intercept her before she could topple under the weight of public abandonment. Delilah felt rather than heard him come to stand a single step below her. The director-level donors in the front pew were already tapping on their phones, composing damage control statements, while somewhere in the balcony the drone pilots wrestled with whether to cut the feed or keep rolling in hope of second act. Redemption. A tear of mascara slipped down Delilah's cheek, intersecting a dusting of highlighter like a black comet, and the collective audience leaned closer, hungry for collision. The chapel doors at the far end remained closed. No clatter of hurried footfalls, no disheveled groom terrified by his own second thoughts. Only the slow, inexorable swell of improvised organ chords and the rising static of whispered speculation filled the void. Callaway inclined his head until his mouth aligned with Delilah's ear, his voice a low vibration that microphone booms could not catch. "We can leave now, and I will handle every consequence," he said, words clipped but strangely warm. "Or we can finish what your courage began in front of these witnesses, just not with the man who fled it." For the first time since she had stepped into the flower-scented nave, Delilah exhaled a full breath. She turned toward Callaway, reading the steadiness of his gaze, the absence of pity in it, the presence instead of something like resolve. Outside, thunder grumbled far off where the morning storm found new ridges to harass. But inside the chapel, a silence pooled so deep it felt as if the building had sunk a few inches into the hill, anchoring itself for whatever seismic shift would follow. Delilah lifted her bouquet until the bronze anemones filled her peripheral vision, their petals dark as cooled copper. Somewhere in the interplay of organ music and heartbeat, she understood that the story the cameras thought they were capturing had slipped its script. A new narrative coiled in the hush, waiting for one decisive gesture to set it spinning. Callaway's hand hovered at Delilah's elbow without quite touching, offering direction rather than possession, and together they walked the final 3 yards to the side door that led from the chancel into the sacristy, their progress shadowed by 1,000 dubious eyes and the tilt of every smartphone still recording. The wooden door closed behind them with a muffled click that felt too small for what it sealed away. On the other side, the congregation erupted in a buzz of disappointed theater critics, but inside the narrow room the hush was sepulchral, disturbed only by the faint crackle of the aging lacquer on the paneled walls reacting to the residual humidity of the departing storm. Dusty sun shafts speared through a mullioned window and settled on a clutter of ceremonial paraphernalia. Unused tapers, hymnals bound in cracked leather, a single silver ewer half full of water for a baptism that would now take place beside an art ecclesiastical scandal. Delilah eased onto an oak prie-dieu as though her spine had forgotten how to lock upright, gloves trembling while she tried to peel them off, but succeeded only in snagging a pearl button on her wrist. The tiny pop startled her into a weak laugh that bordered on hysteria. Callaway crossed the room with the measured grace of someone accustomed to storms breaking around him instead of over him. He found a crystal decanter meant for the post-communion port, poured 2 fingers into a chalice, and offered it without ceremony. She drank, the wine dusk dark against the white lace, and felt it flare along raw nerves like antiseptic. Only when she set the cup aside did she notice Calloway had produced a tablet computer from an inner pocket of his suit, the sleek, matte black model his venture group issued to senior partners, already awake, already displaying a premarital contract template whose language was both brutal and scrupulously fair. She blinked, half in shock, half in reluctant admiration, and he answered the unspoken question in her eyes. Contingency planning was second nature in the Vaughn dynasty, and he had learned long ago that the ratio of chaos to opportunity could be shifted by a document signed at the right moment. His voice, pitched quiet so it would not bounce off the lath and plaster vault, spelled out terms that stunned her with their generosity. Equal control over any joint philanthropic venture. A 7-figure endowment for the Hartwell Preservation Trust, transferred immediately upon execution, and a sunset clause that allowed either to dissolve the union without financial penalty, if, after a year, they found the arrangement untenable. The clauses read like the blueprint of an emergency bridge flung across a chasm, precise engineering in lieu of romance. Yet beneath each sentence Delilah sensed a current of genuine respect, as though Calloway considered her not a damsel to be rescued, but a partner already field-tested by heartbreak, and therefore qualified for any boardroom battlefield. Her fingers hovered above the stylus he offered, the slick surface reflecting the blur of bronze anemones still pinned to her bouquet. And she found herself recalling how abandoned buildings often revealed unexpected strengths only when their walls were stripped to the studs. "Why?" she asked, the single word ragged at the edges. Calloway's reply came on the tail end of a sigh that sounded like someone setting down an invisible weight. Because family reputation could not be rehired once laid off, because architects understood fault lines, and he understood capital and together. Those disciplines might create structures that outlived them both, because he hated to see a promise, any promise, left to rot in public. Outside, the organ faltered, then stopped altogether, and through the thick door they could hear the shuffling of guests gathering coats and unresolved gossip. Time, that slippery negotiator, pressed them. Delilah reached into the bodice of her gown, withdrew the fountain pen Sterling had gifted her during their first site visit date, a retro flourish she had tucked there for sentiment, and unscrewed the cap with hands that stopped shaking once the nib met glass. She signed Delilah Catherine Hartwell in a looping architect's script that had survived 1,000 blueprint revisions, then passed the tablet back. Calloway added his name with the spare, slanted strokes of a man used to initialing 9-figure term sheets before espresso cooled, tapped the encrypted confirmation button, and the contract vanished into secure cloud storage faster than a scandal. Good trend. Footsteps burst inside the nave. Someone had evidently opened the sacristy door, perhaps the coordinator desperate for instruction. But Calloway intercepted that intrusion with a single raised palm and a look that brokered no counteroffer. He then faced Delilah, slipped off his signet ring, heavy black gold inscribed with the Vaughn crest, and in its place wound a length of pale silk ribbon torn from his own pocket square round her finger, tying it in a sailor's knot learned during childhood summers on Cape Cod. "Metal can wait," he murmured. "For now, the bond is enough." Delilah stared at the modest, fraying bow, struck by its quiet defiance of protocol, and for the first time since the aisle had erupted into absence, she felt her heartbeat find a steady rhythm. Beyond the walls, the chapel bells tolled the hour they were meant to announce a completed wedding. Within the sacristy, 2 signatures glowed in encrypted permanence, and an improvised ribbon ring caught a bar of sunlight, fluttering like a white flag, repurposed as a battle standard. The exit from St. Dorothy's turned into a study in choreographed chaos, and it began the moment Calloway unlatched the small cloister door that opened onto the north terrace, a route normally reserved for acolytes, fetching candles, but now the only path that might spare Delilah another gauntlet through pews loaded with spectators. A low wall of ivy shielded them from the majority of cameras, yet word had already leaked that something seismic had occurred. The outer grounds teemed with reporters diverted from the main entrance, their boom mics poking above boxwood shrubs like curious herons. The sky, scrubbed clean by the earlier storm, spread an unsettling clarity overhead. Nothing could hide in that kind of light. Calloway slipped his phone from an inner pocket and executed a series of brisk commands. Encrypted texts to a discreet logistics firm, an authorization code to his chief of staff, then pocketed the device with the same finality a surgeon exhibits when removing a scalpel after the last stitch. Delilah, clutching the fraying silk ribbon now serving as her wedding band, felt strangely weightless, as though the gravity tethering her public persona had snapped, leaving only sensation. The soft rasp of ivy leaves brushed by wind, the botanical tang of anemone sap on her gloves, the electric proximity of the man who had just rearranged the architecture of her future. A black Mercedes Sprinter with no livery crested the gravel drive scarcely 8 minutes later, driven by a former Mossad operative whom Calloway retained for situations more delicate than corporate espionage. The vehicle's rear doors opened to reveal a small seating nook lined in navy alcantara, a mobile sanctuary where velvet curtains could be drawn against the intruding lens of any telephoto zealot. As Delilah stepped inside, camera shutters rattled over the hedge. Questions volleyed. Was the wedding canceled? Where was Sterling? And Calloway's security detail sealed the doors with a soft hydraulic thud that turned the inquiries into muffled white noise. Only when the Sprinter rolled onto the main road did Delilah allow her spine to sink against the seat back and notice her reflection in the tinted glass. Mascara tracks like war paint, veil askew, bronze petals from the bouquet lodged in her hair as though she had survived an explosion in a hothouse. A fractured laugh escaped her, but Calloway merely reached into the console cooler, produced a chilled lavender-scented cloth, and passed it across the aisle with a tact that implied no comment. The van threaded out of the hills toward a private airstrip west of Pittsfield, its route curated to avoid interstate on-ramps where paparazzi might anticipate them. Along the way, Calloway fielded a single call from his legal team, voice clipped, issuing a blackout order on family spokespeople until the marriage announcement could be controlled. The wording left no room for speculation. Delilah listened, struck by the economical calm of a man redirecting a media hurricane with fewer syllables than Sterling once spent ordering coffee. When the call ended, she braced for interrogation. Surely he needed something from her beyond the signature already scrawled on a digital contract. But instead, he asked whether the corset of the gown was cutting her breathing. She realized she had been holding her diaphragm taut for hours, and with his permission she reached behind herself to loosen the laces, sighing as fresh air slid into her lungs like mercy. The jet waiting on the apron was a Gulfstream G600 painted in matte obsidian, its engines idling with the quiet menace of a panther's purr. Calloway guided her up the air stairs. Inside, the cabin's Scandinavian minimalism, oak floors, sand-colored leather, wool throws in fog gray, made the chapel's florid decor feel centuries removed. A flight attendant in discreet navy offered refreshments. Delilah startled herself by requesting sparkling water instead of champagne, as if bubbles of carbon dioxide were the only extravagance she could currently ingest. Once airborne, she unpinned the bouquet, separating the white lupines from the bronze anemones, arranging them on the credenza between jump seats in 2 neat bundles, past and present. Calloway watched, neither helping nor hindering, and when she tucked the bronze half beneath her seat, he understood she meant to preserve the memory, but not let it dominate the cabin like a funeral spray. At cruising altitude, clouds formed vast archipelagos beneath them, and the jet's navigation screens traced a northeasterly trajectory toward Maine. Calloway finally explained the destination. Sitka Rose Island, a rugged speck of granite and spruce 10 nautical miles off the coast, property of the Vaughn family trust, yet uninhabited for decades, except by seabirds and the caretaker who maintained the decommissioned lighthouse. Delilah, who had spent graduate summers cataloging maritime beacons for the National Register, felt her pulse flicker with academic curiosity, despite emotional exhaustion. Calloway unfolded an architectural survey on the cabin table, faded blueprints annotated by hand, pointing out the lighthouse's cracked lens housing and the keeper's cottage sagging toward the cliff. He confessed he had once dreamed of turning the place into an incubator for climate tech startups, but never found the right steward. Perhaps, he suggested, the island might instead become a sanctuary for heritage preservation and renewable energy artistry, led by someone who understood both the poetry of salvaged stone and the mathematics of structural load. Someone, he implied, without flourish, exactly like her. Delilah traced the contour lines on the blueprint with her fingertip, the rhythm of flight soothing her nerves. The idea of redirecting her interrupted wedding energy into a living project sent a subtle current of purpose through her limbs, as though her body recognized that grief metabolizes best when given beams and bolts to arrange. She asked practical questions about barge access, about the lighthouse's historical classification, about the migratory patterns of the black-crested cormorants nesting on its parapet. And with every answer he supplied, she felt the days earlier, shards rearrange into a mosaic that almost made sense. The conversation stretched until landfall shimmered below, a serrated coastline frosted with late-season waves, pine forests so dense they looked poured rather than planted. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing descent to a small private runway on the mainland. From there, they would transfer to a heli launch. During final approach, the sunlight slanted through the oval windows and struck the silk ribbon still tied around Delilah's finger. The frayed ends sparkled like tiny lighthouses themselves, sending errant flashes across the bulkhead. She turned her hand, mesmerized, and realized the knot remained snug despite everything. Turbulence, tears, a half-finished glass of water. And that small persistence became, for her, a quiet covenant more profound than any platinum ring measured by carats. Calloway followed her gaze, offered a half-smile that softened the sharp planes of his financier's face, then leaned back as the landing gear thumped against asphalt. An anchor dropped on the next page of their uncharted map. Outside, spruce trees bowed in the wind, as if acknowledging arrivals they could not yet understand, and the horizon glimmered with the promise of a lighthouse still dark, waiting for a new keeper to relight its lens. The helicopter hop from the mainland to Sitka Rose took 14 minutes, yet those minutes rearranged Delilah's sense of scale as thoroughly as the earlier flight had shifted her longitude. Viewed from 300 feet up, the ocean foamed like shaken seltzer, and the lighthouse rose from the granite spine of the island like a lone chess piece abandoned after an unfinished match. The pilot banked west so the cabin door faced the tower, giving his passengers a preview. Weather-blackened masonry choked by ropes of sea fennel. A lantern room whose glass panes wore a decade's salt bloom, and below it a keeper's cottage with a roof line that sagged toward the leeward side as though the prevailing wind had been leaning on it since Roosevelt's first term. Calloway's expression, usually arranged in the neutral registers of boardroom diplomacy, flickered with something close to reverence. Delilah recognized it because she felt the same internal hush whenever she approached a structure that stood half in ruin, half in refusal to yield. When the skids touched a clearing of flattened rye grass and moss, rotor wash sent snowshoe hares darting for cover and shredded the lingering veil of maritime fog that had clung to the cliff. The caretaker who met them bore the grizzled pragmatism of a man whose social calendar revolved around tides rather than clocks. His name, given in a voice surprisingly soft, was Lyle Dern. He wore oilskin overalls bleached by gull droppings and time, and he greeted Calloway with the cordial nod one offers a landlord who rarely visits but always pays the fuel invoice on schedule. To Delilah he tipped a knit cap, eyes narrowing perceptibly at her silk gown, still the only garment she possessed since leaving the chapel. Yet he refrained from comment, simply motioned toward an ATV fitted with an improvised passenger trailer. The path from the landing pad to the compound wound through spruce that had seeded when the original lens was still kerosene. Gull cries wheeled overhead, and pockets of briny mist pooled in low spots, dampening the gown's hem until it clung like kelp around her calves. The lighthouse up close revealed textures the flyby had hidden. Fracture lines spidering across the granite blocks where freeze-thaw cycles had pried at mortar. Lichen colonies blooming in ochre lacework, a brass plaque from 1904 half eclipsed by barnacle crust. Lyle unlocked the cottage first, its interior redolent of pine pitch and stale coffee. The front room contained two mismatched armchairs facing a cast-iron stove, a battered desk cluttered with radio parts, and a single panoramic window framing the Atlantic like a command deck viewport. Delilah drifted to that window and pressed a palm against the cold glass. Atlantic rollers slammed the cliff below, hurling spume high enough to blur the boundary between house and sea. And in that eruption of noise, she felt the last vestiges of wedding day stage fright shake loose from her nerves. Calloway spread the blueprints across the desk, anchoring corners with whatever objects lay nearest. An antique Morse key, a coil of copper wire, a fossilized scallop shell the size of his palm, and invited Lyle to critique them. The caretaker traced the proposed solar array placement with a weather-cracked finger, grunted approval at the plan to inject epoxy into the lantern room's cracked mullions, and only balked when he saw the idea for a new cantilevered glass walkway that would allow visitors to step into the ocean 30 feet above surf. "Tourists'll think they're gulls till the first nor'easter blows," he warned, voice like gravel rolled in a tin pan. Delilah countered with load-bearing calculations and hurricane-rated glazing specs, and for the first time that day, she felt the old thrill of professional sparring flare beneath her breastbone. Blueprints, unlike vows, did not abandon her at the altar. While the men debated logistics, she explored the cottage alone. Upstairs, she discovered two small bedrooms, each with a view opposite the other. One facing sunrise over the outer shoals, one gazing west toward a ragged scatter of islets that looked, on a clear day, like stepping stones for giants. The western room contained a narrow iron bed frame and a bookshelf whose titles ranged from celestial navigation manuals to a dog-eared volume of Emily Dickinson, its margins annotated in a spidery hand. Something about that juxtaposition, cold math of stars beside lyric heat of solitude, struck Delilah as a secret message about the kind of person who survived winter out here. She found a coat in the closet, oilcloth lined with shearling, far too big for her but serviceable, and slipped it over the remains of the gown. Silk and shearling together felt like two halves of a life she had not thought to combine until today. Back downstairs, Lyle insisted on showing the lantern room before dusk. The climb up the spiral stair tested her calf muscles. Every tread rang a dull chime as she ascended behind Calloway, who moved with cautious respect, a man stepping inside a cathedral not his own. At the gallery level, the smell changed. Rust, fish scale, and the faint perfume of burned whale oil lingering from a century earlier, as though scent could fossilize in air. The Fresnel lens, intact but crazed with microfractures, stood like a vast glass beehive awaiting its queen. Delilah circled it, fingertips hovering a breath shy of the prisms, absorbing the heartbreak of a beacon meant to multiply light reduced now to catching only sunset's last embers. She explained to Calloway how each annular ridge refracted photons, how the geometry of salvation could be measured in angular minutes. And he listened without interrupting, the usual finance metrics recessing from his gaze. When she finished, he asked not what the repair would cost, but how quickly she could assemble a team whose hearts beat for forgotten structures the way hers did. "Give me 48 hours and a satellite phone," she replied, surprising herself with the swiftness of conviction. They descended just as clouds banked on the horizon, purple-bellied and pregnant with a squall. Lyle hustled them to the cottage storeroom where 2 bunks had been hastily made with naval-issue blankets. The island's generator, he warned, hiccuped when humidity rose, so lanterns were prudent. Delilah found a kerosene lamp, trimmed its wick, and watched Calloway struggle with an unfamiliar sleeping bag zipper. The incongruity of a billionaire wrestling nylon teeth made her laugh aloud, a sound that bounced off stone walls and startled them, both into a fleeting, unguarded ease. Outside, gale-force wind began to moan through broken eaves, but inside the cottage a fire crackled in the old stove. Lyle's parting assurance against cold, and shadows danced across blueprints spread under lamplight. Calloway poured 2 measures of Lyle's contraband Irish whiskey into enamel mugs, toasted the provisional architect of the island's resurrection, and for a moment they sat knee to knee, thunder rumbling overhead, a world away from aborted vows and live streams. When the storm crest hit just after midnight, waves pounded the granite so hard the vibration rumbled through floorboards. Yet Delilah felt no fear, only a fierce solidarity with the lighthouse, both of them weathering tempests they had not summoned. She lay awake listening to wind spool around the tower and thought about the ribbon ring, still intact beneath the borrowed coat. It occurred to her that makeshift symbols sometimes endured longer than precious metals because their very fragility demanded mindfulness. In the flicker of dying lamp flame, she glanced at Calloway on the opposite bunk, his features slack in exhausted sleep, and wondered how many contingency plans he had ever filed that felt like this. Impossible, improvised, and strangely luminous in the dark. A gust rattled the window frame, but the panes held, and the lighthouse remained standing, lens catching the sporadic flash of lightning and throwing it, fractured yet undecidedly present, into the wild sea below. Dawn seeped into the cottage like a pale confession, filtering through warped window panes until it spilled across the map-strewn table and revealed the aftermath of the storm. Damp ash in the stove, whiskey rings ghosting the blueprints, and Calloway's discarded blazer draped over a chair back like a flag of truce. Delilah woke with the stiff-limbed ache that follows adrenaline's retreat, and for a full minute she lay in the top bunk orienting herself. Pine-pitch air, roar of surf, the distant clack of Lyle chaining the generator shed, before memory rethreaded. Its jagged needle, chapel, contract, helicopter, lighthouse. She swung down, found her borrowed shearling coat, and padded to the front door where Calloway stood already, silhouette cut against a sky scraped clean by the gale. Below, the ocean bristled under newborn sunlight, and foam gossamer trailed from every rock crevice. The world smelled rinsed and ion bright, the sort of morning that makes ruin look like raw material. He handed her a tin mug of coffee strong enough to scald reluctance, then passed his phone, screen aglow with a curated selection of overnight headlines. Runaway groom vanishes. Billionaire brother steps in. Some articles speculated about a business-savvy rebuke. Others jumped straight to romance, splashing archival photos of Calloway, usually blurred, taken by long-lens opportunists, beside high-resolution pictures of Delilah surveying heritage sites or speaking at preservation summits. Sterling Vaughn, for his part, had issued a midnight statement claiming artistic collapse and profound regret. But the tabloids were less interested in contrition than in the mythic cadence of betrayal and rescue. Delilah's gaze snagged on a comment thread where strangers debated her motives like sports stats. The detachment felt surreal until she remembered each click represented the mathematics of public capital that would, indirectly, fund or starve future restoration projects. She handed the device back with a sigh that condensed in the cold air and asked how long before paparazzi hired fishing charters to ring the island. Calloway replied that NDAs had bought them 24 hours at best. After that, drones would arrive like persistent seabirds. Their window for unpressured decisions was therefore narrow. They spent the morning in what felt like purposeful triage. Lyle guided Delilah through the lighthouse's mechanical entrails. Corroded winch gears, frozen ventilation louvers, a clockwork rotation table jammed by a seashell that must have blown in years earlier. She knelt in silk frayed skirts, cataloging damage on her phone's voice memo. Size of each gear tooth, degree of pitting, likely alloys required. Calloway, meanwhile, turned the keeper's kitchen into a makeshift command hub, unrolling fiber optic cable from a satellite dish case flown in by the logistics team. By noon, the cottage could ping low-orbit satellites despite the island's remoteness, and a trickle of emails began arriving from engineers and conservationists who had received Delilah's midnight SOS. 2 former classmates volunteered to leave a Brooklyn facade stabilization job and drive north with LiDAR scanners. A Norwegian lens historian offered digital schematics of compatible prism replacements. An MIT startup promised prototypes of salt-immune photovoltaic film. Each message widened the project's horizon line, yet each also tethered Delilah more firmly to the risky alliance she had forged with Calloway, because the funding for such audacity could only come from his vaults. After a lunch of tinned salmon on hardtack, Lyle's pantry staples, they sat on a driftwood bench facing the sea to triage the media fallout. Calloway laid out a 3-point plan. First, release a joint statement reframing the spontaneous wedding as a testament to shared philanthropic vision rather than scandal. Second, announce a substantial Vaughan Hartwell endowment for maritime. heritage, thereby shifting headlines from gossip to civic benefit. Third, schedule a limited press visit to the island once basic safety upgrades were in place, turning potential intrusion into curated narrative. Delilah listened, a small knot forming in her chest. The plan was flawless from a communications standpoint, but risked painting their still uncertain bond in permanent ink. She voiced the unease, admitting she feared being subsumed by the Vaughn machine in the same way some historic facades were eclipsed by modern glass towers. Calloway, fingers steepled under his chin, countered that partnership need not mean absorption. He suggested a dual signature protocol on every press release, equal billing on foundation charters, and a governing board weighted to guarantee Hartwell autonomy. The speed with which he offered structural safeguards disarmed her. She realized he was as wary of exploiting her as she was of being exploited, a mutual distrust that paradoxically fertilized trust. The afternoon slid in toward gunmetal light. Delilah returned to the lantern room with a laser level and adhesive markers, mapping fracture patterns across the Fresnel like a doctor outlining hairline ribs on an X-ray. She worked until neck muscles spasmed, unaware of Calloway's approach until she smelled pine smoke from the chimney below. He had lit the stove against the evening chill. Together they descended the gallery, and he suggested a break before hypothermia could sabotage enthusiasm. In the cottage living room, candles glowed among toolboxes and cables. Calloway produced a laptop projecting the first draft of their joint statement. Delilah read it aloud, stumbling on the line that called the day's union, an unexpected convergence of ideals and affections. She asked whether affections overstated matters. He surprised her by admitting he wasn't sure. Words like affection were slower to surface in his vocabulary than metrics, but he felt something adjacent to it and lacked a more precise term. The candor flushed warmth up her throat, and she left the word unchanged. They were revising a paragraph about renewable energy integration when a crackle burst from Lyle's old VHF radio on the desk. An unscheduled helicopter declaring vector toward Sitka Rose, no call sign filed. Lyle, emerging from the kitchen with a mug of chowder, muttered an oath. Unauthorized arrivals this far off grid rarely boded well. Delilah's stomach tightened even before Calloway confirmed the ID ping his security app pulled from the rotorcraft's transponder. Sterling Vaughn. The prodigal groom had apparently chartered his own craft, and, judging by the trajectory, planned to land in 10 minutes. Adrenaline, absent since yesterday, slammed back into Delilah's bloodstream like a door kicked in during a storm. She looked at Calloway, half expecting a boardroom strategy, but instead he rolled down his sleeves, tucked stray cables under the table, and said simply, "Let's meet him outside. Clear lines. No ambush surprises." They stepped onto the wind-swept clearing where afternoon had faded into a bruise-colored dusk. The helicopter swung over the treetops, downdraft flattening beach grass and flaring Delilah's coat like a black-winged bird. When the skids kissed earth, Sterling vaulted out before rotors fully spun down. He wore an expensive pea coat and the unshaven desperation of a man who had rehearsed a grand romantic reversal and was now performing it before the wrong audience. He ignored Calloway entirely, zeroing in on Delilah with imploring eyes. Wind snatched his words, but she caught fragments. Forgive. Panic. Still love. The speech pattern sounded less like apology than like someone pitching a film concept in which he remained the protagonist. Delilah held her ground, glacial calm aided by Calloway's silent presence at her flank. She informed Sterling that the vows he fled were no longer waiting like paused script pages. They had been replaced by a living clause he neither authored nor owned. Sterling's gaze flicked to the ribbon ring, and for the first time uncertainty cracked his theatrical posture. He shifted tactics, aiming barbs at Calloway, accusing him of opportunism, of emotional insider trading. But the allegations fell flat against the lighthouse backdrop, where real wind and real stone dwarfed melodrama. Calloway responded once. He offered to buy Sterling's controlling stake in V-Sphere at a premium, funneling 70% of future profits into the Maritime Heritage Fund. It was more than a buyout. It was a transfer of narrative power. Sterling balked, calculating the hit to his status. Then he noticed Lyle and two security contractors standing beyond the grass, neutral but unyielding. Realizing he had no friendly audience, Sterling's shoulders sagged under a weight neither brother could relieve, and he tossed a sheaf of crumpled headlines into the wind, letting them scatter like wounded gulls before climbing back into the helicopter. Rotors hammered the dusk, and within minutes the machine dwindled toward mainland darkness, leaving only shredded paper drifting across the clearing. Delilah stooped to retrieve a fragment that landed at her feet. It bore a photo of herself walking down the chapel aisle, but in the torn piece Sterling's image was missing, as though excised by fate for poor performance. Night settled. Back inside, the candles had guttered low, and the VHF radio crackled an all clear from Sterling's departing chopper. Calloway set a kettle on the stove, his movements slow now that crisis adrenaline ebbed. Delilah, fingertips still tingling from cold and confrontation, returned the saved headline scrap to the flames. It curled into ember and ascended the flue, a tiny meteor freed from orbit. She stood by the window and watched the lighthouse tower silhouette against star-salted sky, and for the first time since the chapel debacle, she felt an unfractured emotion ripple through her. Something between relief and nascent joy. Calloway joined her, 2 mugs of chamomile in hand, and they observed the dark lens above, still cracked, still dormant, yet poised to blaze again under their stewardship. He asked if she would approve the press statement before morning. She nodded, then surprised herself by resting her head briefly against his shoulder. The gesture was small but unambiguous, like lighting the pilot flame of a lantern that had waited years for a match. Outside, waves kept time against the rock, and the island, caught between tides and headlines, exhaled the quiet certainty that storms end, bulbs reignite, and stories, when steered with deliberate hands, can find bearings truer than any beacon left, untended. Dawn on the 3rd day brought a symphony of prop wash and gull cries as the first wave of Delilah's ad hoc task force descended on Sitka Rose like a relief caravan for a besieged city. The logistics company had chartered 2 Bell 429s outfitted for cargo. Their skids touched down in staggered sequence on the ryegrass clearing, disgorging people and crates with the alacrity of a fire brigade. Out stepped Blythe Jiang, Delilah's former MIT studio rival turned structural dynamics wizard, lugging a LiDAR tripod as casually as a yoga mat. Behind her came twins Carter and Larkin O'Dea, electricians who had just abandoned a Brooklyn facade lighting contract in mid-aim to chase the siren call of a lighthouse lens. They were followed by Dr. Solveig Neistad, a Norwegian physicist whose white paper on adaptive Fresnel prisms had circulated academic circles like samizdat. She arrived clutching a roll of mylar schematics longer than her arm, and wearing an expression equal parts jet lag and missionary zeal. Calloway greeted each newcomer not with the remote courtesy of a financier, but with sleeves already rolled. directing crate placement so efficiently that pallets seemed to float into their designated squares without friction. His billionaire aura had contracted into the kinetic radius of a field captain who understood that money, in its purest form, was simply stored in tension waiting for release. Within an hour, the keeper's cottage morphed into a command hive, humming on caffeine and shared purpose. Blythe's LiDAR scanner projected ultraviolet lattices across the lantern room, mapping microfissures in real time. Solveig pinned transparent overlays onto the kitchen wall, turning pine paneling into a faintly glowing star chart of optic angles. The Odeas commandeered Lyle's generator shed, rewiring its sputtering diesel heart with modular battery packs shipped from a Vaughn-funded clean tech startup. Delilah navigated the whirlwind with the poise of an orchestra conductor whose baton was equal parts authority and empathy. She translated specialist jargon across disciplines, reminded engineers to hydrate, and paused often to scribble measurements along the margins of blueprints until the pages looked like palimpsests of evolving conviction. Somewhere amid the controlled chaos, Calloway set up a satellite link on the cliff edge, broadcasting a live feed to the Vaughn Hartwell Foundation homepage, an unscripted window where donors could watch the real work of salvation instead of slick promo reels. The decision baffled his PR advisors, but delighted the internet, which suddenly preferred the grainy authenticity of wind-blown audio and fogged lenses to the manicured gloss of Sterling's earlier productions. Donations spiked. Hashtags refocused from gossip to grit. By late afternoon, clouds massed offshore, billowing anvil tops that promised another squall, and Delilah pressed for a structural stress test before the weather turned. Blythe rigged strain gauges along the lantern gallery. Solveig calibrated a portable laser to measure lens refraction under intermittent loads, and the Odeas synchronized the newly stabilized rotation table with a temporary LED array. An anemic substitute for the eventual solar-fed beacon, but adequate for diagnostics. Lyle, uncharacteristically silent, watched from the stairwell, fingers worrying the brim of his cap as though praying to ancestors who had kept earlier lamps alive through storms no satellite had measured. At 1647, with barometric pressure nosediving, Delilah gave the nod, and Carter closed the primary breaker. A soft whir rose. The table nudged, and the LED spine ignited. Feeble at first, then brightening until a coherent beam speared the oncoming mist like the white eye of an awakened leviathan. Cheers erupted in 4 accents, echoing down the spiral and out over the cliff. For 42 seconds the light held, sweeping 2 degrees before the system tripped. Sensors reported torque spikes where corrosion still chewed gear teeth. It was a failure in the strict engineering sense, but to Delilah it felt like a heartbeat after a long flatline, proof the patient could yet breathe. The storm that evening arrived faster than models predicted, riding on a nor'easter gust that hammered shutter slats and drowned radio chatter beneath rain like hurled gravel. Inside the cottage, the team huddled around the stove, laptops powered by the new battery bank, recounting decades-old maritime legends as if feeding communal fire with story fuel. Delilah sat cross-legged on the floor, drafting a Phase 2 work schedule while her damp hair dripped onto spreadsheets. Calloway knelt beside her, repairing a stripped screw on her laser level with an improvised microbit. Hands steady despite. Generator lights flickering overhead. There was a moment, brief, unscripted, when another lightning flare revealed their faces inches apart. Concentration lines mirroring, and the room's frenetic buzz receded into a hush that felt neither professional nor accidental. Delilah's pulse ticked, remembering the line in the press statement, "Convergence of ideals and affections," and wondered whether affection could germinate as swiftly as algae blooms after storm runoff. Shortly before midnight, a security alert pinged Calloway's phone. Sterling had formally accepted the buyout offer transmitted during his hasty departure and appended a public letter ceding creative control of vSphere to an interim board. The timing, Calloway noted, was not coincidence. The viewership metrics from the live restoration feed had doubled vSphere's flagship docu-series numbers, proving that authenticity currently outperformed spectacle. He read the letter aloud. When he finished, nobody cheered, but a collective exhale traveled the room, like ballast shifting. Delilah closed her laptop and, for the first time, slid the ribbon ring from her finger, examining the frayed knot now fuzzed by salt and grease. She asked Blythe for a spare zip tie, looped it through the ribbon, and clipped it to her tool belt. No longer jewelry, but a relic of origin, integrated into daily labor. Then she turned to Calloway and suggested that when the real lens finally blazed, they hold a small recommissioning ceremony for the island's handful of residents, and no press at all. A christening for the structure rather than their reputations. Calloway agreed without negotiation. A subtle relinquishing of the Vaughn impulse to showcase victories. The wind eased near 2 a.m., and seafoam moonlight bled through retreating clouds, silvering every window pane. Delilah climbed the lighthouse solo, wanting silence with the mechanical soul she intended to heal. At the gallery, she stood amid dormant prisms and imagined future beams cutting night for sailors yet unseen. Footsteps followed. She knew the cadence now, and Calloway emerged, carrying 2 enamel mugs of cooling coffee. They leaned against the rail, watching bioluminescent surf ignite the cove below in milky turquoise pulses. He told her the first real lighthouse he ever saw was in Skagen at age 12, the summer their mother died. He'd been struck by the paradox that a structure built to stave off wrecks looked, in certain fogs, like a phantom ship itself. Delilah listened, ruefully aware that grief often lays the foundation of vocation, then shared her own origin story. A derelict train depot in Kansas she explored at 16. The echo in its vaulted roof teaching her how space can store longing, the way seashells store roar. Their confessions overlapped like intersecting beams, illuminating spores of empathy previously invisible. Neither spoke of the impulsive marriage or what shape it might settle into after adrenaline cooled. Yet when Delilah's hand drifted to brace against the parapet, Calloway's found it, a clasp more practical than poetic. 2 engineers steadying load against sudden gust. They stayed until the coffee turned lukewarm and Solvay's voice crackled over walkie-talkie that pressure stabilized, concrete curing schedule on track, system ready for tomorrow's second test. Descending the spiral, Delilah traced her fingertips along the iron balustrade and felt, for the first time, the lighthouse's pulse syncing with her own. A shared metronome counting down to the night when fractured glass would mend. Turbines would hum in clean cadence, and a beam worthy of both salvation and love would fuse darkness into direction. The final week before relighting blurred into a single, sleepless continuum in which every hour solved a different century-old failure. Blythe's LiDAR map guided micro-epoxy injections that knit stone like bone. Solvay's adaptive prisms arrived by seaplane and nested into the Fresnel crown with a sound like a sword returning to its scabbard. and the Odeya twins strung kilometers of marine-grade cable through wind-scoured conduits until the lantern room pulsed with a heartbeat of renewable wattage no storm could veto. Meanwhile, Delilah, moving on caffeine and pure architectural adrenaline, choreographed each trade like a maestro, translating between torque figures and poetic intent so fluently that even Lyle, once skeptical, began referring to her blueprints as the new scripture. Calloway matched her pace not with money alone, but with presence, splicing fiber lines on the cliff at dawn, hauling crates at noon, fielding midnight vendor crises that would have derailed a lesser bankroll. Yet all the while he deferred credit, insisting the island's resurrection belonged to the craft hands and the woman who had imagined light while standing in wedding wreckage. On the last afternoon they ran the full-power trial. Delilah stood at the lens console, voice steady despite a tremor in her spine as she counted down. Blythe monitored stress telemetry, Solvay balanced refractor temperature profiles, and Calloway watched the chronometer. When Delilah pressed the activation pad, the prism stack flowered in concentric brilliance, rotating on frictionless bearings that hummed like distant strings, and a spear of white gold light leapt across the Atlantic, striking the low cloud bank and exploding it into a million molten petals. Cheers rose. Grown men sobbed. Lyle banged a crescent wrench on the rail. Delilah's knees wobbled. Yet Calloway only closed his eyes a moment, exhaling as if some ancestral debt had finally been paid. They held the beam for 5 minutes, shut it down for optics cooling, and declared the system commission-ready. Word traveled on encrypted channels to donors and Coast Guard liaisons. Still, Delilah kept her vow of privacy. The formal lighting ceremony would be small, press-barred, the guest list limited to the project crew, 3 harbor masters, and the local, Mi'kmaq elder, who once used the island as a seasonal fishing waypoint. At sunset, fog rolled in soft as gauze, a perfect projection screen, and lanterns were strung along the catwalk while the kitchen produced chowder thick with saffron and tarragon, its scent wrapping the tower in homely invitation. Before the ignition switch, Delilah asked everyone to sign a single ledger page. Names, roles, a one-sentence hope for the light. When the book reached Calloway, he wrote, in tidy block letters, that this beacon outlast every fear it was born from, and beneath it he slipped a folded document rescinding the sunset clause in their whirlwind marriage contract, replacing it with an open-ended partnership charter that granted Delilah veto rights equal to his own, a legal palindrome mirroring the equality he had promised in the sacristy but now considered permanent. She read it, eyes stinging, and signed without speaking. Gestures mattered more than syllables when the sky itself was waiting. At 2017, the Mi'kmaq elder offered a cedar smoke blessing in words older than any maritime chart. Lyle rang the brass fog bell that had not sounded since 1968, and Delilah pulled the lever. The Fresnel ignited, climbed to full luminance, and swept the horizon in a 360-degree arc that carved the night open like a compass of flame. Fishermen 20 miles off cut their engines to witness. Satellites pinged anomalous glare, and in Boston a cluster of late-shift journalists watched the live feed in silence, the usual headline machinery stilled by sheer awe. On the catwalk, Delilah felt Calloway's hand settle at the small of her back. Light, steady, not claiming but anchoring. And she leaned into it just enough to confirm what the beam already spelled across water, that some structures are never more alive. Then in the moment they finish breaking and begin to shine. Morning sunlight arrived at Sitka Rose 5 weeks after the relighting, with the unobtrusive confidence of a system that finally trusts its own equilibrium. Settling on freshly painted railings, solar shingles that warmed like lazy sealbacks, and the stack of completed inspection certificates tucked behind Lyle's radio as if even bureaucracy wished to bask. The island had never been busier, yet the atmosphere no longer throbbed with emergency. It vibrated instead with the low, steady hum of an enterprise that knew its purpose. A rotation of apprentice masons from the state university clanked chisels against a secondary retaining wall, testing traditional lime mortar under Delilah's watchful eye and the Odias's voltage meters, because the new interpretive center would integrate augmented reality wiring inside 100-year-old stone. Solveig, having extended her stay until the optics feel like family, cultivated a miniature algae farm beside the solar array to test bioluminescent backup markers for nights when even LED redundancy might fail. Blythe spent mornings at her laptop refining a predictive maintenance algorithm that cross-referenced weather telemetry with microstrain sensor data to forecast stress hotspots before hairline cracks emerged. A preemptive strike against entropy that Delilah swore would someday become standard at every heritage site with Wi-Fi. Calloway oscillated between the island and the mainland with a pattern that had ceased to look like commutes and begun to resemble tides. On shore, he shepherded the newly restructured V-sphere through shareholder unrest and an ethics overhaul, installing documentary storytellers in board seats previously occupied by advertisers. The network's first post-Sterling flagship would be a serialized, slow cinema chronicle of maritime lights around the world, filmed with the same authenticity viewers had seen in Sitka Rose's raw feed. Offshore, he traded tailored suits for denim and a tool belt, rewiring outdoor footpath lights or climbing the tower to polish brass fittings that gleamed anyway. Because even a man who commands capital benefits from the tactile proof that his hands can still alter the stories they finance. He and Delilah developed a conversational cadence so natural it surprised them both. Technical debate in the morning, shared silence at midday while they absorbed the screech of turns, unchecked laughter after dinner when Lyle's horror tales of Rogue waves chased interns to their bunks. One Saturday, after the last supply boat of the season had disgorged crates of winter staples, Delilah led Calloway to the western bedroom, the one that first revealed the lighthouse's two-sided gaze, and opened a flat wooden case she had kept private since arriving. Inside lay panels of vellum sketched with a new design. Not blueprints for a structure, but for a series of overlapping trusts that would transfer majority control of Hartwell Preservation and Vaughan Legacy into an independent foundation governed by a rotating slate of restoration professionals, coastal tribal representatives, and, eventually, selected apprentices who had served on at least one lighthouse project. The paperwork would prevent hostile takeover by any single donor, including themselves, and require unanimous board consent before any heritage asset could be commercialized beyond a capped threshold. She admitted the proposal had brewed in her head during those first nights after the chapel, when she lay awake counting cracked glass prisms and wondering what other invisible fissures might threaten future beacons. Calloway read every paragraph. Eyebrows quirked not in objection, but appreciation of legal elegance, then asked why she had chosen now to show him. She answered that the beam sweeping Maine's horizon no longer needed saving. Her concern had shifted to what would protect the protectors if money ever soured into motive. Without hesitation, he took the pen she offered added his signature beneath hers, and dated it with the day's full sun and moon designation. A sailor's superstition that what is logged under both celestial cycles becomes enduring chart. Winter arrived like a disciplined stage crew, replacing blue sky curtains with pewter backdrops and swapping gull soundtracks for the deeper percussion of brash ice grinding against rock. The final supply boat left before Thanksgiving, and 36 hours later, the first nor'easter sealed shipping lanes. Sitka Rose became a snow-crowned citadel ringed by surf that hissed like poured sand, and for the first time Delilah felt the tower's ancient intention, to bear witness in solitude, settle into her own marrow. The project team dispersed to warmer quarters, promising spring returns. Only Lyle, Delilah, and Calloway remained, caretakers of a quieter but no less vital rhythm. Days organized themselves around maintenance checks, meteorological logs, and long walks where conversation dwindled into the vast conversationalism of wind. Nights revolved around the lantern's rotation interval. Every 8 seconds the beam swept the cottage window, embossing their silhouettes onto opposite walls like recurring captions that reminded them both why they were here and who they had become. The first Friday of full isolation, Calloway declared the kitchen table a no-work zone after dinner and slid a battered chess set between their mugs of mulled cider. Delilah feigned ignorance until her bishop took his rook in 5 moves, and the contest devolved into giggles as Lyle shouted color commentary from his armchair. Never underestimate an architect. She gambles with load paths for sport. When she delivered checkmate with a queen pinned by her own knight, Calloway raised both hands in surrender, then, in a gesture devoid of any boardroom flourish, removed the ribbon zip-tied to her belt. Its fibers had frayed into feathered edges, dyed variously with rust, graphite, and a single streak of prism adhesive. He asked whether she might finally trade it for metal of her choosing. She hesitated, thumb rubbing the worn knot, and said the ribbon had earned retirement, but she would not bury it in a drawer. Instead, she slipped it into the hollow of the cottage's doorframe behind a loose plank, sealing the makeshift talisman inside the building's bones so future restorers would find it and ponder the improbable vows that launched a lighthouse revival. Then she accepted a simple titanium ring he produced, no stones, etched inside with the coordinates not of Sitka Rose, but of St. Dorothy's Chapel. Because, he whispered, even wrecked beginnings deserve the cartographic honor. She slid it on, surprised that the cold metal warmed instantly against skin earned by calluses. When the calendar flipped to January, the U.S. Coast Guard sent word that the relighted tower had already prevented 2 near groundings during early blizzards. One freighter captain wrote a personal letter, admitting he had plotted his course too tight before recalibrating on the unexpected shine of Hartwell Light, a moniker appearing on updated nav apps faster than bureaucracy could approve it. The letter sat on the mantel the night Calloway finally told Delilah about the childhood in Denmark he seldom discussed, the loneliness of translating grief for a mother into equations that bankers understood but relatives found cold. Delilah responded with her own confessional, the fear that every successful restoration invited a greater failure, that preserving history sometimes meant crystallizing inequities one should instead dismantle. Their vulnerability threaded the room like a new type of rigging, strong because multiple strands carried the strain. Later, among stove embers, they built the habit of shoulder touches and forehead kisses unremarkable enough to seem inevitable. And if occasionally the memory of chapel humiliation surfaced, Delilah found Calloway's hand already waiting, not to erase, but to steady, Spring, when it did come, arrived on the back of an osprey, whose wings beat the thaw across the cove. It found the lighthouse immaculate, panels gleaming, algorithms self-reporting trivial wear, and the interpretive center framed out with responsibly harvested spruce, ready for volunteer carpenters' return. On the mainland, the newly independent foundation purchased 3 more endangered beacons, one of them Sterling's personal suggestion sent without flourish. A small act of atonement. Reporters tried again to book island access, but the Foundation's media policy remained firm. Only crews willing to document process over personality gained entry, and even then the lighthouse determined filming windows with the same impartial rotation of its lens. By the equinox, Sitka Rose was no longer headline but legacy, its story embedded in maritime databases, educational curricula, and the private memories of those who had hammered, wired, or simply watched in wonder from distant shores. On the eve of the anniversary of the aborted wedding, Delilah and Calloway returned to St. Dorothy's, this time unannounced and unaccompanied, carrying nothing but a thermos of clam chowder and the ledger page signed by the crew. Now framed in driftwood, the chapel caretaker, recognizing them, unlocked the door and left them alone in the nave. Dust motes floated through stained glass light that once presided over disaster. Now it bathed them in spectral calm. They set the frame where the altar flowers had stood and poured chowder into enamel cups, toasting the ruin that seeded rescue. Delilah traced the carved lupines on the pew ends, marveling at how frailty and endurance often share wood grain. And when she turned back, Calloway was kneeling, not in proposal, for that right already lived in titanium, but in gratitude, touching the floorboards as though to thank the space for its flawed but necessary role. She joined him, and together they rose. 2 engineers of intangible architecture whose greatest blueprint, she realized, was neither the fortress of their foundation nor the welded bones of a lighthouse, but the quiet scaffolding of trust capable of spanning from catastrophe to radiance without collapsing under the weight of human error. They stepped outside into spring air, vibrant with chance, the horizon no longer a distant line but a rotating beam they carried within, programmed now to sweep every darkness they encountered and carve it steadily into direction.